Chapter 27 of Campaigning with Grant by Horace Porter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 27. Meeting of Grant and Sherman at City Point. Amusing colloquy between Mrs. Grant and Sherman. Meeting of Sherman and Sheridan. The famous conference aboard the River Queen. Grant starts on his last campaign. Stormbound. Grant and Sheridan confer. Grant on Warren's front. Carrying instructions to Sheridan. Sherman, in his correspondence, had intimated a desire to have a personal conference with his chief before the general movement of all the armies took place, and it was learned on March 27 that he had arrived at Fort Monroe, and was on his way up the James. Grant telegraphed to several prominent officers to meet Sherman that evening at headquarters. Late in the afternoon, the Russia, a captured steamer, arrived with Sherman on board, and General Grant and two or three of us who were with him at the time started down to the wharf to greet the Western commander. Before we reached the foot of the steps, Sherman had jumped ashore and was hurrying forward with long strides to meet his chief. As they approached, Grant cried out, "How do you do, Sherman?" "How are you, Grant?" replied Sherman, and in a moment they stood upon the steps with their hands locked in a cordial grasp, uttering earnest words of familiar greeting. Their encounter was more like that of two schoolboys coming together after a vacation than the meeting of the chief actors in the great war tragedy. Sherman walked up with the general-in-chief to headquarters, where Mrs. Grant extended to the illustrious visitor a cordial greeting. Sherman then seated himself with the others by the campfire and gave a most graphic description of the stirring events of his march through Georgia. The story was the more charming from the fact that it was related without the manifestation of the slightest egotism. His field of operations had covered more than half of the entire theater of war. His orders always spoke with the true bluntness of the soldier. He had fought from valley depths to mountain heights, and marched from inland rivers to the sea. Never were listeners more enthusiastic, never was a speaker more eloquent. The story, told as he alone could tell it, was a grand epic related with Homeric power. At times he became humorous, and in a nervous, off-hand, rattling manner, recounted a number of amusing incidents of the famous march. He said, among other things, "My old veterans got on pretty familiar terms with me on the march, and often used to keep up a running conversation with me as I rode along by their side. One day a man in the ranks had pulled off his shoes and stockings and rolled up his trousers as far as they would go to wade across a creek we had struck. I couldn't help admiring his magnificently developed limbs, which might have served as models for a sculptor, and I called out to him, 'A good stout pair of legs you've got there, my man.' 'Yes, General, they're not bad underpinning,' he replied, looking down at them with evident pride. 'I wouldn't mind exchanging mine for them, if you don't object,' I continued. He sized up my legs with his eye, and evidently considered them mere spindle shanks compared with his, and then looked up at me and said, 'General, if it's all the same to you, I guess I'd rather not swap.'" Sherman then went on to talk about his famous bummers, saying, "They are not stragglers, or mere self-constituted foragers, as many have been led to suppose, but they are organized for a very useful purpose from the adventurous spirits who are always found in the ranks. They serve as feelers, who keep in advance and on the flanks of the main columns, spy out the land, and discover where the best supplies are to be found. They are indispensable in feeding troops when compelled, like my army, to live off the country, and in destroying the enemy's communications. The bummers are, in fact, a regular institution. I was amused at what one of Schofield's officers told me at Goldsboro. He said Schofield's army was maintaining a telegraph line to keep up communication with the seacoast, and that one of my men, who was a little more previous than the rest, and was far in advance of my army, was seen up a telegraph pole, hacking away at the wires with a hatchet. The officer yelled out to him, 'What are you doing there? You're destroying one of our own telegraph lines.' The man cast an indignant look at his questioner, and said, as he continued his work of destruction, 'I'm one of Billy Sherman's bummers, and the last thing he said to us when we started out on this hunt was, "Be sure and cut all the telegraph wires you come across, and don't go to fooling away time asking who they belong to."'" After the interview had continued nearly an hour, Grant said to Sherman, "I'm sorry to break up this entertaining conversation, but the President is aboard the River Queen, and I know he will be anxious to see you. Suppose we go and pay him a visit before dinner." "All right," cried Sherman, and the generals started down the steps, and were soon after seated in the cabin of the steamer with the President. In about an hour the two commanders came back and entered the general in chief's hut. I was there talking to Mrs. Grant at the time. She, with her usual thoughtfulness, had prepared some tea, and was awaiting the return of the generals. She at once inquired in her womanly way, "Did you see Mrs. Lincoln?" "Oh," replied her husband, "we went rather on a business errand, and I did not ask for Mrs. Lincoln." "And I didn't even know she was aboard," added Sherman. "Well, you are a pretty pair!" exclaimed Mrs. Grant. "I do not see how you could have been so neglectful." "Well, Julia," said her husband, "we are going to pay another visit in the morning, and will take good care then to make amends for our conduct to day. "And now let us talk further about the immediate movements of my army," said Sherman. "Perhaps you don't want me here listening to all your secrets," remarked Mrs. Grant. "Do you think we can trust her, Grant?" exclaimed Sherman, casting a sly glance at Mrs. Grant. "I'm not so sure about that, Sherman," said the commander, entering into the spirit of fun which had now taken possession of the trio. "Public documents, in disseminating items of information, are accustomed to say, 'Know all men by these presents.' I think it would be just as effective to say, 'Know one woman,' for then all men would be certain to hear of it." Sherman laughed heartily at this way of putting it, and said, "Now, Mrs. Grant, let me examine you, and I can soon tell whether you are likely to understand our plans well enough to betray them to the enemy." "Very well," she answered. "I'm ready for all your questions." Then Sherman turned his chair squarely toward her, folded his arms, assumed the tone and look of a first-class pedagogue, and in a manner which became more and more amusing as the conversation went on, proceeded to ask all sorts of geographical questions about the Carolinas and Virginia. Mrs. Grant caught the true essence of the humor, and gave replies which were the perfection of drollery. When asked where a particular river in the South was, she would locate it 1,000 miles away, and describe it as running upstream instead of down; and when questioned about a Southern mountain, she would place it somewhere in the region of the North Pole. Railroads and canals were also mixed up in interminable confusion. She had studied the maps in camp very carefully, and had an excellent knowledge of the geography of the theater of war, and this information stood her in good stead in carrying on the little comedy which was being enacted. In a short time Sherman turned to his chief, who had been greatly amused by the byplay, and exclaimed, "Well, Grant, I think we can trust her." And then, speaking again to the general's wife, he said, "Never mind, Mrs. Grant. Perhaps some day the women will vote and control affairs, and then they will take us men in hand and subject us to worse cross-examinations than that." "Not if my plan of female suffrage is ever adopted," remarked the chief. "Why, Eulace, you never told me you had any plans regarding that subject," said Mrs. Grant. "Oh, yes," continued the general, "I would give each married woman 2 votes. Then the wives would all be represented at the polls without there being any divided families on the subject of politics." Dinner was now announced, and Sherman escorted Mrs. Grant to the mess room, and occupied a seat beside her at the table. In the evening several officers came to pay their respects to Sherman. Sheridan had been telegraphed to come to headquarters, but he did not appear until nearly midnight, and after all the others had left. He had been delayed several hours by his train running off the track on the military railroad. Sherman had been told by Grant about the plans he had discussed with Sheridan for the operations of the cavalry, and Sherman urged that it should join him after destroying the railroads on the way. Sheridan became a good deal nettled at this, and argued earnestly against it, but General Grant soon cut short the discussion by saying that it had been definitely decided that Sheridan was to remain with our army then in front of Petersburg. Sheridan's command was made separate from the Army of the Potomac, and was to be subject only to direct orders from the general in chief. The cavalry commander had cheerfully given up the command of the Middle Military Division to take the field at the head of the cavalry corps, and General Grant felt that he was entitled to every consideration which could be shown him. The next morning, March 28, Admiral Porter came to headquarters, and in the course of his conversation said to Sherman: "When you were in the region of those swamps and overflowed rivers coming through the Carolinas, didn't you wish you had my gunboats with you?" "Yes," replied Sherman, "for those swamps were very much like that Western fellow's 4th of July oration, of which a newspaper said it was only knee deep, but spread out over all creation." One day on the march, while my men were wading a river which was surrounded for miles by swamps on each side, after they had been in the water for about an hour, with not much prospect of reaching the other side, one of them cried out to his chum: "Say, Tommy, I'm blowed if I don't believe we struck this river lengthways." After spending a quarter of an hour together, General Grant said that the President was expecting them aboard his boat, and the two generals and the admiral started for the River Queen. No one accompanied them. There now occurred in the upper saloon of that vessel the celebrated conference between these four magnates, the scene of which has been so faithfully transferred to canvas by the artist Healy. It was in no sense a council of war, but only an informal interchange of views between the four men who, more than any others, held the destiny of the nation in their hands. Upon the return of the generals and the admiral to headquarters, they entered the general in chief's hut, where Mrs. Grant and one or two of us were sitting. The chief said to his wife: "Well, Julia, as soon as we reached the boat this morning, I was particular to inquire after Mrs. Lincoln, and to say that we desired to pay our respects to her. The President went to her stateroom and soon returned, saying that she was not well and asking us to excuse her." General Grant afterward told us the particulars of the interview. It began by his explaining to the President the military situation and prospects, saying that the crisis of the war was now at hand, as he expected to move at once around the enemy's left and cut him off from the Carolinas, and that his only apprehension was that Lee might move out before him and evacuate Petersburg and Richmond, but that if he did there would be a hot pursuit. Sherman assured the President that in such a contingency his army, by acting on the defensive, could resist both Johnston and Lee till Grant could reach them, and that then the enemy would be caught in a vise and have his life promptly crushed out. Mr. Lincoln asked if it would not be possible to end the matter without a pitched battle, with the attendant losses and suffering, but was informed that that was a matter not within the control of our commanders, and must rest necessarily with the enemy. Lincoln spoke about the course which he thought had better be pursued after the war, and expressed an inclination to lean toward a generous policy. In speaking about the Confederate political leaders, he intimated, though he did not say so in express terms, that it would relieve the situation if they should escape to some foreign country. Sherman related many interesting incidents which occurred in his campaign. Grant talked less than any one present. The President twice expressed some apprehension about Sherman being away from his army, but Sherman assured him that he had left matters safe in Schofield's hands, and that he would start back himself that day. That afternoon Sherman took leave of those at headquarters, and returned to his command in the Bat, as that vessel was faster than the one which had brought him up the coast. The troops had been in motion the previous night, and the general had decided that headquarters should be moved on the morning of the 29th. The horses were to be put aboard the train which was to take the general and staff to the Petersburg front. About 8:30 Mr. Lincoln came ashore to say good bye. We had the satisfaction of hearing one good story from him before parting. General Grant was telling him about the numerous ingenious and impractical suggestions that were made to him almost daily as to the best way of destroying the enemy, and said: "The last plan proposed was to supply our men with bayonets just a foot longer than those of the enemy, and then charge them. When they met, our bayonets would go clear through the enemy, while theirs would not reach far enough to touch our men, and the war would be ended." Mr. Lincoln laughed and remarked: "Well, there is a good deal of terror in cold steel. I had a chance to test it once myself. When I was a young man, I was walking along a back street in Louisville one night about 12 o'clock, when a very tough-looking citizen sprang out of an alleyway, reached up to the back of his neck, pulled out a bowie knife that seemed to my stimulated imagination about 3 feet long, and planted himself square across my path. For 2 or 3 minutes he flourished his weapon in front of my face, appearing to try to see just how near he could come to cutting my nose off without quite doing it. He could see in the moonlight that I was taking a good deal of interest in the proceeding, and finally he yelled out, as he steadied the knife close to my throat, "Stranger, can you lend me $5 on that?" I never reached in my pocket and got out money so fast in all my life. I handed him a banknote and said, "There's 10, neighbor. Now put up your scythe." The general soon after bade an affectionate good-bye to Mrs. Grant, kissed her repeatedly as she stood at the front door of his quarters. She bore the parting bravely, although her pale face and sorrowful look told of the sadness that was in her heart. The party, accompanied by the President, then walked down to the railroad station. Mr. Lincoln looked more serious than at any other time since he had visited headquarters. The lines in his face seemed deeper, and the rings under his eyes were of a darker hue. It was plain that the weight of responsibility was oppressing him. Could it have been a premonition that with the end of this last campaign would come the end of his life? 5 minutes' walk brought the party to the train. There the President gave the general and each member of the staff a cordial shake of the hand, and then stood near the rear end of the car while we mounted the platform. As the train was about to start, we all raised our hats respectfully. The salute was returned by the President, and he said in a voice broken by an emotion he could ill conceal, "Good-bye, gentlemen. God bless you all. Remember, your success is my success." The signal was given to start. The train moved off. Grant's last campaign had begun. The general sat down near the end of the car, drew from his pocket the flint and slow match that he always carried, struck a light, and was soon wreathed in the smoke of the inevitable cigar. I took a seat near him with several other officers of the staff, and he at once began to talk over his plans. Referring to Mr. Lincoln, he said, "The President is one of the few visitors I have had who have not attempted to extract from me a knowledge of my movements, although he is the only one who has a right to know them. He intends to remain at City Point for the present, and he will be the most anxious man in the country to hear from us, his heart is so wrapped up in our success. But I think we can send him some good news in a day or two." I never knew the general to be more sanguine of victory than in starting out on this campaign. When we reached the end of the railroad, we mounted our horses, started down the Vaughan Road, and went into camp for the night in an old cornfield just south of that road, close to Gravelly Run. That night, March 29, the army was disposed in the following order from right to left: Weitzel in front of Richmond, with a portion of the Army of the James; Parke and Wright holding our works in front of Petersburg; Ord extending to the intersection of Hatcher's Run and the Vaughan Road; Humphreys stretching beyond Dabney's Mill; Warren on the extreme left, reaching as far as the junction of the Vaughan Road and the Boynton Plank Road; and Sheridan still farther west at Dinwiddie Court House. The weather had been fair for several days, and the roads were getting in as good condition for the movement of troops as could be expected, for in that section of country in summer the dust was usually so thick that the army could not see where to move, and in winter the mud was so deep that it could not move anywhere. The weather had now become cloudy, and toward evening rain began to fall. It descended in torrents all night, and continued with but little interruption during the next day. The country was densely wooded and the ground swampy, and by the evening of the 30th whole fields had become beds of quicksand in which the troops waded in mud above their ankles, horses sank to their bellies, and wagons threatened to disappear altogether. The men began to feel that if anyone in after years should ask them whether they had been through Virginia, they could say, "Yes, in a number of places." The roads soon became sheets of water, and it looked as if the saving of that army would require the services not of a Grant, but of a Noah. Soldiers would call out to officers as they rode by, "I say, fetch along the pontoons." "When are the gunboats coming up?" The buoyancy of the day before was giving place to gloom. Men lost their tempers, and those who employed profanity on such occasions as a means of mental relaxation wanted to set up a mark and go to swearing at it. Some began to be apprehensive that the whole movement was premature. This led to an animated debate at headquarters. General Rawlins expressed the opinion around the camp fire on the morning of the 30th that no forage could be hauled out to our cavalry, that Joe Johnston might come up in our rear if we remained long in our present position, and that the success of turning Lee's right depended on our celerity; that now he had been given time to make his dispositions to thwart us, and that it might be better to fall back and make a fresh start later on. General Grant replied by saying that if Johnston could move rapidly enough in such weather to reach us, he, Grant, would turn upon him with his whole command, crush him, and then go after Lee, and that as soon as the weather cleared up the roads would dry rapidly, and the men's spirits would recover all their former buoyancy. The general then entered his tent, and Rawlins followed him. Just then we saw Sheridan turning in from the Vaughan Road with a staff officer and an escort of about a dozen cavalrymen, and coming toward our headquarters camp. He was riding his white pacer named Breckinridge, a horse which had been captured from General Breckinridge in the Valley of Virginia. But instead of striking a pacing gait now, it was at every step driving its legs knee-deep into the quicksand with the regularity of a pile driver. As soon as Sheridan dismounted, he was asked with much eagerness about the situation on the extreme left. He took a decidedly cheerful view of matters, and entered upon an animated discussion of the coming movements. He said, "I can drive in the whole cavalry force of the enemy with ease, and if an infantry force is added to my command, I can strike out for Lee's right, and either crush it or force him so to weaken his entrenched lines that our troops in front of him can break through and march into Petersburg." He warmed up with the subject as he proceeded, threw the whole energy of his nature into the discussion, and his cheery voice, beaming countenance, and impassioned language showed the earnestness of his convictions. "How do you expect to supply your command with forage if this weather lasts?" he was asked by one of the group. "Forage?" said Sheridan. "I'll get up all the forage I want. I'll haul it out if I have to set every man in the command to corduroying roads, and corduroy every mile of them from the railroad to Dinwiddie. I tell you, I'm ready to strike out tomorrow and go to smashing things." And pacing up and down, he chafed like a hound in the leash. We told him that this was the kind of talk we liked to hear, and that while General Grant felt no apprehension, it would do his heart good to listen to such words as had just been spoken. Sheridan, however, objected to obtruding his views unbidden upon the general-in-chief. Then we resorted to a stratagem. One of us went into the general's tent and told him Sheridan had just come in from the left and had been telling us some matters of much interest, and suggested that he be invited in and asked to state them. This was assented to, and Sheridan was told that the general wanted to hear what he had to say. Sheridan then went in and found Grant and Rawlins still discussing the situation. Several persons soon after came into the tent, and Sheridan, saying he was cold and wet, stepped out to the campfire. The general-in-chief remarked that he wanted to have some words with Sheridan in private before parting, and followed him out. Ingalls said his tent was vacant, and Grant and Sheridan entered it and had a talk there, in which a definite understanding was reached as to Sheridan's immediate movements. In about 20 minutes they came out, and Sheridan mounted his horse, waved us a good-bye with his hand, and rode off to Dinwiddie. The next morning, March 31, Sheridan reported that the enemy had been hard at work entrenching at Five Forks, and to a point about a mile west of that place. Lee had been as prompt as Grant to recognize Five Forks, the junction of 5 roads, as a strategic point of great importance, and to protect his right, had sent there a large force of infantry and nearly all his cavalry. The rain had continued during the night of March 30, and on the morning of the 31st the weather was cloudy and dismal. General Grant had anticipated that Warren would be attacked that morning, and had warned him to be on the alert. Warren advanced his corps to develop with what force the enemy held the White Oak road, and to try and drive him from it. But before he had gone far he was met by a vigorous assault. When news came of the attack, General Grant directed me to go to the spot and look to the situation of affairs there. I found that Warren's troops were falling back, but he was reinforced by Humphreys, and by noon the enemy was checked. As soon as Grant was advised of the situation, he directed Meade to take the offensive vigorously, and the enemy was soon driven back. General Grant had now ridden out to the front, and hearing that he was at Mrs. Butler's house near the Boynton Plank Road, I joined him there. It was then a little after 1 o'clock. He had in the meantime ordered the headquarters camp to be moved to Dabney's Mill, about 2 miles from Meade's camp. Warren's corps was now ordered to move forward again for the purpose of deterring the enemy from detaching infantry from that portion of the line to send against Sheridan. The advance was made later in the afternoon, and with decided success. When this movement had been decided upon, General Grant directed me to go to Sheridan and explain what was taking place on Warren's and Humphreys' front, and have a full understanding with him as to the future operations in his vicinity. I rode rapidly down the Boynton Plank Road, and soon came to Gravelly Run. The bridge was destroyed, but my horse was able to ford the stream, notwithstanding the high water caused by the recent rains. Hearing heavy firing in the direction of the Five Forks Road, I hurried on in that direction by way of the Brooks Road, and soon saw a portion of our cavalry moving eastward, pressed by a superior force of the enemy, while another portion was compelled to fall back southward toward Dinwiddie. I turned the corner of the Brooks Cross Road and the Five Forks Road just as the rear of the latter body of cavalry was passing it, and found one of Sheridan's bands with his rear guard playing Nellie Bly as cheerfully as if furnishing music for a country picnic. Sheridan always made an effective use of his bands. They were usually mounted on gray horses, and instead of being relegated to the usual duty of carrying off the wounded and assisting the surgeons, they were brought out to the front and made to play the liveliest airs in their repertory, which produced excellent results in buoying up the spirits of the men. After having several of their instruments pierced by bullets, however, and the drums crushed by shells, as often happened, it must be admitted that the music, viewed purely in the light of an artistic performance, was open to adverse criticism. I found Sheridan a little north of Dinwiddie Court House, and gave him an account of matters on the left of the Army of the Potomac. He said he had had one of the liveliest days in his experience, fighting infantry and cavalry with only cavalry, but that he would hold his position at Dinwiddie at all hazards. He did not stop there, but declared his belief that with the corps of infantry which he expected to be put under his command, he could take the initiative the next morning and cut off the whole of the force which Lee had detached. He said, "This force is in more danger than I am. If I am cut off from the Army of the Potomac, it is cut off from Lee's army, and not a man in it ought ever to be allowed to get back to Lee. We at last have drawn the enemy's infantry out of its fortifications, and this is our chance to attack it." He begged me to go to General Grant at once and urge him to send me Wright's corps, because it had been under his command in the Valley of Virginia, and was familiar with his way of fighting. I told him, as had been stated to him before, that Wright's corps was next to our extreme right, and that the only corps which could reach him by daylight was Warren's. I returned soon after to headquarters at Dabney's Mill, a distance of about 8 miles, reaching there at 7 p.m., and gave the general a full description of Sheridan's operations. He took in the situation in an instant, and at once telegraphed the substance of my report to Meade, and preparations soon began looking to the sending of Warren's corps and Mackenzie's small division of cavalry to report to Sheridan. It was expected that the infantry would reach its destination in ample time to take the offensive about daybreak, But one delay after another was met with, and Grant, Meade, and Sheridan spent a painfully anxious night in hurrying forward the movement. Ayres's division of Warren's corps had to rebuild the bridge over Gravelly Run, which took till 2 a.m. Warren, with his other two divisions, did not get started from their position on the White Oak Road till 5 a.m., and the hope of crushing the enemy was hourly growing less. This proved to be one of the busiest nights of the whole campaign. Generals were writing dispatches and telegraphing from dark to daylight. Staff officers were rushing from one headquarters to another, wading through swamps, penetrating forests, and galloping over corduroy roads, carrying instructions, getting information, and making extraordinary efforts to hurry up the movement of the troops. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Campaigning with Grant by Horace Porter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 28. The Movement against Five Forks. The Battle of Five Forks. Carrying the news of Five Forks to Grant. Grant prepares to assault the Petersburg lines. Capturing the works at Petersburg. Grant writes dispatches under fire. Capture of Forts Gregg and Whitworth. Early the next morning, April 1, General Grant said to me, "I wish you would spend the day with Sheridan's command and send me a bulletin every half hour or so, advising me fully as to the progress made. You know my views, and I want you to give them to Sheridan fully. Tell him the contemplated movement is left entirely in his hands, and he must be responsible for its execution. I have every confidence in his judgment and ability. I hope that there may now be an opportunity of fighting the enemy's infantry outside of their fortifications." I set out with half a dozen mounted orderlies to act as couriers in transmitting field bulletins, and met Sheridan about 10 a.m. on the Five Forks Road not far from J. Boisseau's house. Ayres had his division on this road, having arrived about daylight, and Griffin had reached J. Boisseau's between 7 and 8 a.m. I had a full conference with Sheridan, in which he told me that the force in front of him had fallen back early in the morning, that he had pursued with his cavalry, had had several brushes with the enemy, and was driving him steadily back, that he had had his patience sorely tried by the delays which had occurred in getting the infantry to him, but that he was going to make every effort to strike a heavy blow with all the infantry and cavalry as soon as he could get them into position, provided the enemy should make a stand behind his intrenchments at Five Forks, which seemed likely. While we were talking, General Warren, who had accompanied Crawford's division, rode up and reported in person to Sheridan. It was then 11 o'clock. A few minutes before noon, Colonel Babcock came over from headquarters and said to Sheridan, "General Grant directs me to say to you that if, in your judgment, the Fifth Corps would do better under one of its division commanders, you are authorized to relieve General Warren and order him to report to him, General Grant, at headquarters." General Sheridan replied in effect that he hoped such a step as that might not become necessary, and then he went on to speak of his plan of battle. We all rode on farther to the front, and soon met General Devin of the cavalry, who was considerably elated by his successes of the morning, and loudly demanded to be permitted to make a general attack on the enemy. Sheridan told him he didn't believe he had ammunition enough. Said Devin, "I guess I've got enough to give 'em one surge more." Colonel Babcock now left us to return to headquarters. About 1 o'clock it was reported by the cavalry that the enemy was retiring to his entrenched positions at Five Forks, which was just north of the White Oak Road and parallel to it, his earthworks running from a point about 3/4 of a mile east of Five Forks to a point a mile west, with an angle or crotchet about 100 yards long thrown back at right angles to the left of his line to protect that flank. Orders were at once given to Warren's corps to move up to the Gravelly Run Church Road, to the open ground near the church, and form in order of battle, with Ayres on the left, Crawford on his right, and Griffin in rear as a reserve. The corps was to wheel to the left and make its attack upon the angle, and then, moving westward, sweep down in rear of the enemy's entrenched line. The cavalry, principally dismounted, was to deploy in front of the enemy's line and engage his attention, and as soon as it heard the firing of our infantry, to make a vigorous assault upon his works. The Fifth Corps had borne the brunt of the fighting ever since the army had moved out on March 29, and the gallant men who composed it, and who had performed a conspicuous part in nearly every battle in which the Army of the Potomac had been engaged, seemed eager once more to cross bayonets with their old antagonists. But the movement was slow, the required formation seemed to drag, and Sheridan, chafing with impatience and consumed with anxiety, became as restive as a racer struggling to make the start. He made every possible appeal for promptness, dismounted from his horse, paced up and down, struck the clenched fist of one hand against the palm of the other, and fretted like a caged tiger. He exclaimed at one time, "This battle must be fought and won before the sun goes down. All the conditions may be changed in the morning. We have but a few hours of daylight left us. My cavalry are rapidly exhausting their ammunition, and if the attack is delayed much longer, they may have none left." And then another batch of staff officers was sent out to gallop through the mud and hurry up the columns. At 4 o'clock the formation was completed, the order for the assault was given, and the struggle for Pickett's entrenched line began. The Confederate infantry brigades were posted from left to right as follows: Terry, Corse, Stewart, Ransom, and Wallace. General Fitzhugh Lee, commanding the cavalry, had placed W. H. F. Lee's 2 brigades on the right of the line, Munford's division on the left, and Rosser's in rear of Hatcher's Run to guard the trains. I rode to the front, in company with Sheridan and Warren, with the head of Ayres's division, which was on the left. Ayres threw out a skirmish line and advanced across an open field, which sloped down gradually toward the dense woods just north of the White Oak Road. He soon met with a fire from the edge of these woods, a number of men fell, and the skirmish line halted and seemed to waver. Sheridan now began to exhibit those traits which always made him a tower of strength in the presence of an enemy. He put spurs to his horse and dashed along in front of the line of battle from left to right, shouting words of encouragement and having something cheery to say to every regiment. "Come on, men," he cried. "Go at 'em with a will. Move on at a clean jump, or you'll not catch one of 'em. They're all getting ready to run now, and if you don't get on them in 5 minutes, they'll every one get away from you. Now go for 'em." Just then a man on the skirmish line was struck in the neck. The blood spurted as if the jugular vein had been cut. "I'm killed," he cried, and dropped to the ground. "You're not hurt a bit," cried Sheridan. "Pick up your gun, man, and move right on to the front." Such was the electric effect of his words that the poor fellow snatched up his musket and rushed forward a dozen paces before he fell, never to rise again. The line of battle of weather-beaten veterans was now moving right along down the slope toward the woods with a steady swing that boded no good for Pickett's command, earthworks or no earthworks. Sheridan was mounted on his favorite black horse, Rienzi, which had carried him from Winchester to Cedar Creek, and which Buchanan Reed made famous for all time by his poem of "Sheridan's Ride." The roads were muddy, the fields swampy, the undergrowth dense, and Rienzi, as he plunged and curveted, kept dashing the foam from his mouth and the mud from his heels. Had the Winchester pike been in a similar condition, it is altogether likely that he would not have made his famous 20 miles without breaking his own neck as well as Sheridan's. This historic horse derived his name from the fact that he was presented to Sheridan by the 2nd Michigan Cavalry in the little town of Rienzi, Mississippi, in 1862. After the famous ride he was sometimes called Winchester. He was of Black Hawk blood. He bore Sheridan in nearly all his subsequent battles. When the animal died in 1878, in his 20th year, his body was stuffed and now stands in the museum on Governor's Island. The surviving veterans often decorate his body with flowers on Memorial Day. Mackenzie had been ordered up the Crump Road with directions to turn east on the White Oak Road and whip everything he met on that route. He encountered a small cavalry command and whipped it, according to orders, and then came galloping back to join in the general scrimmage. Soon Ayres's men met with a heavy fire on their left flank, and had to change directions by facing more toward the west. As the troops entered the woods and moved forward over the boggy ground and struggled through the dense undergrowth, they were staggered by a heavy fire from the angle, and fell back in some confusion. Sheridan now rushed into the midst of the broken lines and cried out, "Where is my battle flag?" As the sergeant who carried it rode up, Sheridan seized the crimson and white standard, waved it above his head, cheered on the men, and made heroic efforts to close up the ranks. Bullets were now humming like a swarm of bees about our heads, and shells were crashing through the ranks. A musket ball pierced the battle flag. Another killed the sergeant who had carried it. Another wounded an aide, Captain McGonigal, in the side. Others struck 2 or 3 of the staff officers' horses. All this time Sheridan was dashing from one point of the line to another, waving his flag, shaking his fist, encouraging, entreating, threatening, praying, swearing, the true personification of chivalry, the very incarnation of battle. It would be a sorry soldier who could help following such a leader. Ayres and his officers were equally exposing themselves at all points in rallying the men, and soon the line was steadied, for such troops could suffer but a momentary check. Ayres, with drawn saber, rushed forward once more with his veterans, who now behaved as if they had fallen back only to get a good ready, and with fixed bayonets and a rousing cheer dashed over the earthworks, sweeping everything before them, and killing or capturing every man in their immediate front whose legs had not saved him. Sheridan spurred Rienzi up to the angle, and with a bound the animal carried his rider over the earthworks and landed among a line of prisoners who had thrown down their arms and were crouching close under the breastworks. Some of them called out, "What do you want us all to go to?" Then Sheridan's rage turned to humor, and he had a running talk with the Johnnies as they filed past. "Go right over there," he said to them, pointing to the rear. "Get right along now. Oh, drop your guns. You'll never need them any more. You'll all be safe over there. Are there any more of you? We want every one of you, fellows." Nearly 1,500 were captured at the angle. An orderly here came up to Sheridan, saluted, and said, "Colonel Forsyth of your staff is killed, sir." "It's no such thing," cried Sheridan. "I don't believe a word of it. You'll find Forsyth's all right." 10 minutes later Forsyth rode up. He had been mistaken for the gallant General Winthrop, who had fallen in the assault. Sheridan did not even seem surprised when he saw Forsyth, and merely said, "There, I told you so." This incident is mentioned as illustrative of a peculiar trait of Sheridan's character, which never allowed him to be disturbed by camp rumors, however disastrous. The dismounted cavalry had assaulted as soon as they heard the infantry fire open. The natty cavalrymen, with their tight-fitting jackets and short carbines, swarmed through the pine thickets and dense undergrowth, looking as if they had been especially equipped for crawling through knot-holes. The cavalry commanded by the gallant Merritt made a final dash, went over the earthworks with a hurrah, captured a battery of artillery, and scattered everything in front of them. Here Custer, Devin, Fitzhugh, and the other cavalry officers were in their element, and vied with each other in deeds of valor. Crawford's division had moved off in a northerly direction, marching away from Ayres, and leaving a gap between the two divisions. Sheridan became exceedingly annoyed at this circumstance, complained that Warren was not giving sufficient personal supervision to the infantry, and sent nearly all his staff officers to the 5th Corps to see that the mistakes made were corrected. After the capture of the angle, I started off toward the right to see how matters were going there. I went in the direction of Crawford's division on our right. Warren, whose personal gallantry was always conspicuous, had had his horse shot while with these troops. I passed around the left of the enemy's works, then rode due west to a point beyond the Ford Road. Here I rejoined Sheridan a little before dark. He was laboring with all the energy of his nature to complete the destruction of the enemy's forces and to make preparations to protect his own detached command from a possible attack by Lee's army in the morning. He said to me that he had just relieved Warren and placed Griffin in command of the 5th Corps. I had been sending frequent bulletins to the general in chief during the day, and now dispatched a courier announcing the change of corps commanders, and giving the general result of the round up. Sheridan had that day fought one of the most interesting tactical battles of the war, admirable in conception, brilliant in execution, strikingly dramatic in its incidents, and productive of immensely important results. I said to him, "It seems to me that you have exposed yourself today in a manner hardly justifiable on the part of a commander of such an important movement." His reply gave what seems to be the true key to his uniform success in the field. "I have never in my life taken a command into battle and had the slightest desire to come out alive unless I won." About 7:30 I started for general headquarters. The roads in many places were corduroyed with captured muskets. Ammunition trains and ambulances were still struggling forward. Teamsters, prisoners, stragglers, and wounded were choking the roadway. The coffee boilers had kindled their fires in the woods. Cheers were resounding on all sides, and everybody was riotous over the victory. A horseman had to pick his way through this jubilant condition of things as best he could, as he did not have a clear right of way by any means. As I galloped past a group of men on the Boydton Plank Road, my orderly called out to them the news of the victory. The only response he got was from one of them, who raised his open hand to his face, put his thumb to his nose, and yelled, "No, you don't! April Fool!" I then realized that it was the 1st of April. I had ridden so rapidly that I reached headquarters at Dabney's Mill before the arrival of the last courier I had dispatched. General Grant was sitting, with most of the staff about him, before a blazing campfire. He wore his blue cavalry overcoat, and the ever-present cigar was in his mouth. I began shouting the good news as soon as I got in sight, and in a moment all but the imperturbable general-in-chief were on their feet, giving vent to boisterous demonstrations of joy. For some minutes there was a bewildering state of excitement, and officers fell to grasping hands, shouting, and hugging each other like schoolboys. The news meant the beginning of the end, the reaching of the last ditch. It pointed to peace and home. Dignity was thrown to the winds, and every man at that moment was in a fitting mood to dig his elbows into the ribs of the Archbishop of Canterbury, or to challenge the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court to a game of leapfrog. The proprieties of army etiquette were so far forgotten in the enthusiasm of the occasion that as soon as I had thrown myself from my horse, I found myself rushing up to the general-in-chief and clapping him on the back with my hand, to his no little astonishment, and to the evident amusement of those about him. Badeau, in his military history of Ulysses S. Grant, says in referring to this scene, "The bearer of the good news was Colonel Horace Porter, one of the most abstemious men in the army, but he came up with so much enthusiasm, clapping the general-in-chief on the back, and otherwise demonstrating his joy, that the officer who shared his tent rebuked him at night for indulging too freely in drink at this critical juncture. But Porter had tasted neither wine nor spirits that day. He was only drunk with victory." Editor. The general, as might have been expected, asked his usual question, "How many prisoners have been taken?" I was happy to report that the prisoners this time were estimated at over 5,000, and this was the only part of my recital that seemed to call forth a responsive expression from his impassive features. After having listened attentively to the description of Sheridan's day's work, the general, with scarcely a word of comment, walked into his tent, and by the light of a flickering candle took up his manifold writer, and after finishing several dispatches, handed them to an orderly to be sent over the field wires, came out and joined our group at the campfire, and said as coolly as if remarking upon the state of the weather, "I have ordered a general assault along the lines." This was about 9 o'clock in the evening. In his conversation his sense of humor now began to assert itself. During the day I had sent him a bulletin saying, "I have noticed among the prisoners and dead many old men whose heads are quite bald." This was mentioned as an evidence that the enemy in recruiting was robbing the grave. Ingalls was sitting with us. His hair had become so thin that he used to part it low behind and comb the stray locks forward, trying to make the rear guard do picket duty at the front. The general delighted in teasing him on this subject, and looking towards him, he now said to me, "When I got your message to-day about the bald-headed men, I showed it to Ingalls, and told him he had better take care and not fall into the hands of the enemy, for that is just the way they would be commenting on his head in their reports." Grant was anxious to have the different commands move against the enemy's lines at once to prevent Lee from withdrawing troops and sending them against Sheridan. Meade was all activity, and so alive to the situation, and so anxious to carry out the orders of the general in chief, that he sent word that he was going to have the troops make a dash at the works without waiting to form assaulting columns. Grant at 9:30 p.m. sent a message that he did not mean to have the corps attack without assaulting columns, but to let the batteries open at once and to feel out with skirmishers, and if the enemy was found to be leaving, to let the troops attack in their own way. The corps commanders reported that it would be impractical to make a successful assault until morning, but sent back replies full of enthusiasm and having in them a ring of the true soldierly metal. Ord said he would go into the enemy's works as a hot knife goes into butter. Wright sent word that when he started in he would make the fur fly, and said, "If the corps does half as well as I expect, we will have broken through the rebel lines in 15 minutes from the word go." Grant was highly pleased with the spirit evinced in these messages, and said, "I like the way Wright talks. It argues success. I heartily approve." The hour for the general assault was fixed at 4 o'clock the next morning. Miles was ordered to march with his division at midnight to reinforce Sheridan and enable him to make a stand against Lee in case he should move westward in the night. A little after midnight the general tucked himself into his camp bed and was soon sleeping as peacefully as if the next day was to be devoted to a picnic instead of a decisive battle. Everyone at headquarters had caught as many cat naps as he could, so as to be able to keep both eyes open the next day in the hope of getting a sight of Petersburg and possibly Richmond. And now 4 o'clock came, but no assault. It was found that to remove abatis, climb over chevaux de frise, jump rifle pits, and scale parapets, a little daylight would be of material assistance. At 4:45 there was a streak of gray in the heavens, which soon revealed another streak of gray formed by Confederate uniforms in the works opposite, and the charge was ordered. The thunder of hundreds of guns shook the ground like an earthquake, and soon the troops were engaged all along the lines. The general awaited for a while the result of the assault at headquarters, where he could be easily communicated with, and from which he could give general directions. At 5:15 a message came from Wright that he had carried the enemy's line in his front and was pushing in. Next came news from Parke that he had captured the outer works with 12 pieces of artillery and 800 prisoners. At 6:40 the general wrote a telegram with his own hand to Mr. Lincoln at City Point, as follows: "Both Wright and Parke got through the enemy's line. The battle now rages furiously. Sheridan, with his cavalry, the 5th Corps, and Miles's division of the 2nd Corps, which was sent to him since 1 this morning, is now sweeping down from the west. All now looks highly favorable. Ord is engaged, but I have not yet heard the result in his front." A cheering dispatch was also sent to Sheridan, winding up with the words, "I think nothing is now wanting but the approach of your force from the west to finish up the job on this side." Soon Ord was heard from as having broken through the intrenchments. Humphreys, too, had been doing gallant work. At 7:30 the line in his front was captured, and half an hour later Hays's division of his corps had carried an important earthwork with 3 guns and most of the garrison. At 8:30 a.m. a despatch was brought in from Ord saying that some of his troops had just captured the enemy's works south of Hatcher's Run. The general and staff now rode out to the front, as it was necessary to give immediate direction to the actual movements of the troops, and prevent confusion from the overlapping and intermingling of the several corps as they pushed forward. He urged his horse over the works which Wright's corps had captured, and suddenly came upon a body of 3,000 prisoners marching to our rear. His whole attention was for some time riveted upon them, and we knew that he was enjoying his usual satisfaction in seeing so large a capture. Some of the guards told the prisoners who the general was, and they manifested great curiosity to get a good look at him. Next he came up with a division of Wright's corps, flushed with success, and rushed forward with a dash that was inspiriting beyond description. When they caught sight of the leader whom they had patiently followed from the Rapidan to Petersburg, their cheers broke forth with a will, and their enthusiasm knew no limit. The general galloped along toward the right, and soon met Meade, with whom he had been in constant communication, and who had been urging on the Army of the Potomac with all vigor. Congratulations were rapidly exchanged, and both went to pushing forward the good work. Grant, after taking in the situation, directed both Meade and Ord to face their commands more toward the east and close up toward the inner lines which covered Petersburg. Lee had been pushed so vigorously that he seemed for a time to be making but little effort to recover any of his lost ground, but now he made a determined fight against Parke's corps, which was threatening his inner line on his extreme left, and the bridge across the Appomattox. Repeated assaults were made, but Parke resisted them all successfully, and could not be stirred from his position. Lee had ordered Longstreet's command from the north side of the James, and with these troops reinforced his extreme right. General Grant dismounted near a farmhouse which stood on a knoll, from which he could get a good view of the field of operations. He seated himself on the ground at the foot of a tree, and was soon busy receiving dispatches and writing orders to officers conducting the advance. The position was under fire, and as soon as the group of staff officers was seen, the enemy's guns began paying their respects to the party. This lasted for about a quarter of an hour, and as the fire became hotter and hotter, several of the officers, apprehensive for the general's safety, urged him to move to some less conspicuous position, but he kept on writing and talking, without the least interruption from the shots falling around him, and apparently not noticing what a target the place was becoming, or paying any heed to the gentle reminders to move on. After he had finished his dispatches, he got up, took a view of the situation, and as he started toward the other side of the farmhouse, said with a quizzical look at the group around him, "Well, they do seem to have the range on us." The staff was now sent to the various points of the advancing lines, and all was activity in pressing forward the good work. By noon, nearly all the outer line of works was in our possession, except two strong redoubts which occupied a commanding position, named respectively Fort Gregg and Fort Whitworth. The general decided that these should be stormed, and about 1 o'clock 3 of Ord's brigades swept down upon Fort Gregg. The garrison of 300 men, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel J. H. Duncan, with 2 rifled cannon, made a desperate defense, and a gallant contest took place. For half an hour after our men had gained the parapet, a bloody hand-to-hand struggle continued, but nothing could stand against the onslaught of Ord's troops, flushed with their morning victory. By 2:30, 57 of the brave garrison lay dead, and the rest had surrendered. Fort Whitworth was abandoned, but the guns of Fort Gregg were opened upon the garrison as they marched out, and the commander, Colonel Joseph M. Jane, and 60 men surrendered. About this time Miles struck a force of the enemy at Sutherland Station, on Lee's extreme right, and captured 2 pieces of artillery and nearly 1,000 prisoners. At 4:40, the general, who had been keeping Mr. Lincoln fully advised of the history that was so rapidly being made that day, sent him a telegram inviting him to come out the next day and pay him a visit. A prompt reply was received from the President, saying, "Allow me to tender you and all with you the nation's grateful thanks for the additional and magnificent success. At your kind suggestion, I think I will meet you tomorrow." Prominent officers now urged the general to make an assault on the inner lines and capture Petersburg that afternoon, but he was firm in his resolve not to sacrifice the lives necessary to accomplish such a result. He said the city would undoubtedly be evacuated during the night, and he would dispose the troops for a parallel march westward and try to head off the escaping army. And thus ended this eventful Sunday. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Campaigning with Grant by Horace Porter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 29. Grant enters Petersburg. Lincoln at Petersburg. In hot pursuit of Lee. Grant makes a night ride to reach Sheridan. Grant hurries on to Farmville. Grant at Farmville. Grant opens a correspondence with Lee. The ride to Curdsville. Grant suffers an attack of illness. More correspondence with Lee. The general was up at daylight the next morning, and the first report brought in was that Parke had gone through the lines at 4 a.m., capturing a few skirmishers, and that the city had surrendered at 4:28 to Colonel Ralph Ely. A second communication surrendering the place was sent in to Wright. General Grant's prediction had been fully verified. The evacuation had begun about 10 the night before, and was completed on the morning of the 3rd. Between 5 and 6 a.m. the general had a conference with Meade, and orders were given to push westward with all haste. About 9 a.m. the general rode into Petersburg. Many of the citizens, panic-stricken, had escaped with the army. Most of the whites who remained stayed indoors. A few groups of negroes gave cheers, but the scene generally was one of complete desertion. Grant rode along quietly until he came to a comfortable-looking brick house with a yard in front, No. 21 Market Street, the residence of Mr. Thomas Wallace, and here he and the staff dismounted and took seats on the piazza. A number of the citizens now gathered on the sidewalk and stood gazing with eager curiosity upon the features of the commander of the Yankee armies. Soon an officer came with a dispatch from Sheridan, who had been reinforced and ordered to strike out along the Danville Railroad, saying he was already 9 miles beyond Namazine Creek and pressing the enemy's trains. The general was anxious to move westward at once with the leading infantry columns, but he prolonged his stay until the President came up. Mr. Lincoln soon after arrived, accompanied by Robert, who had ridden back to the railroad station to meet him, and by his little son Tad and Admiral Porter. He dismounted in the street and came in through the front gate with long and rapid strides, his face beaming with delight. He seized General Grant's hand as the general stepped forward to greet him, and stood shaking it for some time, and poured out his thanks and congratulations with all the fervor of a heart which seemed overflowing with its fullness of joy. I doubt whether Mr. Lincoln ever experienced a happier moment in his life. The scene was singularly affecting, and one never to be forgotten. He said, "Do you know, General, I had a sort of sneaking idea all along that you intended to do something like this, but I thought some time ago that you would so maneuver as to have Sherman come up and be near enough to cooperate with you." "Yes," replied the general, "I thought at one time that Sherman's army might advance far enough to be in supporting distance of the Eastern armies when the spring campaign against Lee opened, but I had a feeling that it would be better to let Lee's old antagonists give his army the final blow, and finish up the job. If the Western troops were even to put in an appearance against Lee's army, it might give some of our politicians a chance to stir up sectional feeling in claiming everything for the troops from their section of country. The Western armies have been very successful in their campaigns, and it is due to the Eastern armies to let them vanquish their old enemy single-handed." I see," said Mr. Lincoln, "but I never thought of it in that light. In fact, my anxiety has been so great that I didn't care where the help came from, so that the work was perfectly done." "Oh," General Grant continued, "I do not suppose it would have given rise to much of the bickering I mentioned, and perhaps the idea would not have occurred to any one else. I feel sure there would have been no such feeling among the soldiers. Of course, I would not have risked the result of the campaign on account of any mere sentiment of this kind. I have always felt confident that our troops here were amply able to handle Lee." Mr. Lincoln then began to talk about the civil complications that would follow the destruction of the Confederate armies in the field, and showed plainly the anxiety he felt regarding the great problems in statecraft which would soon be thrust upon him. He intimated very plainly in a conversation that lasted nearly half an hour that thoughts of leniency to the conquered were uppermost in his heart. Meanwhile, his son Tad, for whom he always showed a deep affection, was becoming a little uneasy, and gave certain appealing looks, to which General Sharp, who seemed to understand the mute expressions of small boys, responded by producing some sandwiches, which he offered to him, saying, "Here, young man, I guess you must be hungry." Tad seized them as a drowning man would seize a life preserver, and cried out, "Yes, I am. That's what's the matter with me." This greatly amused the President and the General in Chief, who had a hearty laugh at Tad's expense. A gentleman, whom we supposed was the proprietor of the house, asked the General to go into the parlor, but he declined politely, saying, "Thank you, but I am smoking." The General hoped that before he parted with Mr. Lincoln he would hear that Richmond was in our possession, but after waiting about an hour and a half he said he must ride on to the front and join Ord's column, and took leave of the President, who shook his hand cordially, and with great warmth of feeling wished him Godspeed and every success. The General and staff had ridden as far as Sutherland Station, about 9 miles, when a despatch from Weitzel overtook them, which had come by a roundabout way. It read: "We took Richmond at 8:15 this morning. I captured many guns. The enemy left in great haste. The city is on fire in 2 places. I am making every effort to put it out. The people received us with enthusiastic expressions of joy." Although the news was expected, there were loud shouts of rejoicing from the group who heard it read. The General, as usual, did not manifest the slightest sign of emotion, and merely remarked, "I am sorry I did not get this information before we left the President. However, I suppose he has heard it by this time," and then added, "Let the news be circulated among the troops as rapidly as possible." Grant and Meade both went into camp at Sutherland Station that evening, April 3. The Army of the Potomac caught but a few hours' sleep, and at 3 the next morning was again on the march. The pursuit had now become swift, unflagging, relentless. Sheridan, the Inevitable, as the enemy had learned to call him, was in advance, thundering on with his cavalry, followed by Griffin and the rest of the Army of the Potomac, while Ord was swinging along toward Burkeville to head off Lee from Danville, to which point it was naturally supposed he was pushing in order to unite with Joe Johnston's army. April 4 was another active day. The troops were made to realize that this campaign was to be won by legs, that the great walking match had begun, and success depended upon which army could make the best distance record. Grant rode this day with Ord's troops. Meade was quite sick, and had to take at times to an ambulance, but his loyal spirit never flagged, and all his orders breathed the true spirit of a soldier. That night General Grant camped at Wilson Station on the South Side Railroad, 27 miles west of Petersburg. A railroad engineer who had been brought in as a prisoner reported that Davis and his cabinet had passed through Burkeville on their way south early on the morning of the day before. The next morning the general sent a despatch to Sherman in North Carolina, giving him an account of the situation, containing instructions as to his future movements, and winding up with the famous words, "Rebel armies are now the only strategic points to strike at." On the 5th he marched again with Ord's column, and at noon reached Nottoway Court House, about 10 miles east of Burkeville, where he halted with Ord for a couple of hours. A young staff officer here rode up to Ord in a state of considerable excitement, and said, "Is this a way station?" The grim old soldier, who was always fond of a quiet joke, replied with great deliberation, "This is not a way station." The staff collected around General Grant on the front porch of the old town tavern, and while examining maps and discussing the movements, a ringing despatch came in from Sheridan, saying he had captured 6 guns and some wagons, and had intercepted Lee's advance toward Burkeville; that Lee was in person at Amelia Court House, etc. This news was given to the passing troops, and lusty cheers went up from every throat. They had marched about 15 miles already that day, and now struck out as if they were good for 15 more, and vowed that they were going to beat the record of the cavalry. We continued to move along the wagon road, which runs parallel to the South Side Railroad, till nearly dark, and had by that time reached a point about halfway between Nottoway and Burkeville. The road was skirted by a dense woods on the north side, the side toward the enemy. A commotion suddenly arose among the headquarters escort, and on looking around I saw some of our men dashing up to a horseman in full Confederate uniform, who had emerged like an apparition from the woods, and in the act of seizing him as a prisoner. I recognized him at once as the scout who had brought the important dispatch sent by Sheridan from Columbia to City Point. I said to him, "How do you do, Campbell?" and told our men he was all right and was one of our people. He said he had had a hard ride from Sheridan's camp, and had brought a dispatch for General Grant. By this time the general had also recognized him, and had ridden up to him and halted in the road to see what he had brought. Campbell took from his mouth a small pellet of tinfoil, opened it, and pulled out a sheet of tissue paper on which was written the famous dispatch so widely published at the time, in which Sheridan described the situation at Jetersville, and added, "I wish you were here yourself." The general said he would go at once to Sheridan, and dismounted from his black pony, Jeff Davis, which he had been riding, and called for his horse, Cincinnati. He stood in the road for a few minutes and wrote a dispatch to Ord, using the pony's back for a desk, and then, mounting the fresh horse, told Campbell to lead the way. It was found that he would have to skirt pretty closely to the enemy's lines, and it was thought that it would be prudent to take some cavalry with us, but there was none near at hand, and the general said he would risk it with our mounted escort of 14 men. Calling upon me and 3 other officers to accompany him, he started off. I had in the meanwhile questioned the scout about the trip, and found that we would have to follow some crossroads through a wooded country, and travel nearly 20 miles. It was now dark, but there was enough moonlight to enable us to see the way without difficulty. After riding for nearly 2 hours, the enemy's campfires were seen in the distance, and it was noticed that the fence rails were thrown down in a number of places, indicating that cavalry had been moving across this part of the country, though we were certain our cavalry had not been there. Knowing that scouts are seldom trustworthy, and are often in the employ of both sides, and feeling that the general's safety was now entirely in the power of a comparatively unknown man, I, for one, began to grow suspicious. Just then Campbell fell back several paces, and suddenly turned his horse into a piece of woods which we were skirting, and seemed to be acting in a manner that indicated either confusion or treachery. I cocked my pistol and rode close behind him, thinking his feelings would stand that much in the way of precaution anyhow, and determined that if he was caught giving any suspicious signals I would at once arrest him. The scout, however, was thoroughly loyal, and one of Sheridan's most trusted men. No thought of treachery had crossed his mind. He was only looking for a short cut through the woods. About 10:30 o'clock we struck Sheridan's pickets. They could hardly be made to understand that the general-in-chief was wandering about at that hour with so small an escort, and so near to the enemy's lines. The cavalry were sleeping on their arms, and as our little party picked its way through their ranks, and the troopers woke up and recognized the general in the moonlight, their remarks were highly characteristic of the men. One said, "Why, there's the old man! Boys, this means business." And another, "Great Scott! The old chief's out here himself. The Rebs are going to get busted tomorrow, certain." And a third, "Uncle Sam's joined the cavalry sure enough. You can bet there'll be lively times here in the morning." Sheridan was awaiting us, feeling sure that the general would come after getting his dispatch. A good supper of beef, cold chicken, and coffee was soon prepared, and it was quickly demonstrated that the night ride had not impaired any one's appetite. When the general-in-chief had learned fully the situation in Sheridan's front, he first sent a message to Ord to watch the roads running south from Burkeville and Farmville, and then went over to Meade's camp near by. Meade was lying down and still suffering from illness. His views differed somewhat from General Grant's regarding the movements of the Army of the Potomac for the next day, and the latter changed the dispositions that were being made, so as to have the army unite with Sheridan's troops in swinging round more toward the south and heading off Lee in that direction. The next day, April 6, proved a decided field day in the pursuit. It was found in the morning that Lee had retreated during the night from Amelia Court House, and from the direction he had taken, and information received that he had ordered rations to meet him at Farmville, it was seen that he had abandoned all hope of reaching Burkeville, and was probably heading for Lynchburg. Ord was to try to burn the High Bridge over the Appomattox, and pushed on to Farmville. Sheridan's cavalry was to work round Lee's left flank, and the Army of the Potomac was to make another forced march, and strike the enemy wherever it could reach him. I spent a portion of the day with Humphreys' corps, which attacked the enemy near Deatonsville, and gave his rear guard no rest. I joined General Grant later, and rode with him to Burkeville, getting there some time after dark. Ord had pushed out to Rice's Station, and Sheridan and Wright had gone in against the enemy and fought the battle of Sailor's Creek, capturing 6 general officers and about 7,000 men, and smashing things generally. General Grant broke camp and started from Burkeville early the next morning, the 7th, and moved rapidly in the direction of Farmville. The columns were crowding the roads, and the men, aroused to still greater efforts by the inspiriting news of the day before, were sweeping steadily along, despite the rain that fell like trained pedestrians on a walking track. As the general rode among them, he was greeted with shouts and hurrahs on all sides, and a string of sly remarks which showed how familiar swords and bayonets become when victory furnishes the topic of their talk, such as, "Cavalry's skin out, General. Infantry's going to crush the rest of the mud," and "We've marched nigh 20 miles on this stretch, and we're good for 20 more if the general says so," and "We're not straddling any hosses, but we'll get there all the same." The general raised his hat in acknowledgment of the cheers, and gave a pleasant nod to each of the men who addressed him. A little before noon on April 7, 1865, General Grant, with his staff, rode into the little village of Farmville on the south side of the Appomattox River, a town that will be memorable in history as the place where he opened the correspondence with Lee, which 2 days later led to the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia. He drew up in front of the village hotel, a comfortable brick building, dismounted, and established headquarters on its broad piazza. News came in that Crook was fighting large odds with his cavalry on the north side of the river, and I was directed to go to his front and see what was necessary to be done to assist him. I found that he was being driven back, the enemy, Mumford's and Rosser's cavalry divisions under Fitzhugh Lee, having made a bold stand north of the river. Humphreys was also on the north side, isolated from the rest of our infantry, confronted by a large portion of Lee's army, and having some heavy fighting. On my return to general headquarters that evening, Wright's corps was ordered to cross the river and move rapidly to the support of our troops there. Notwithstanding their long march that day, the men sprang to their feet with a spirit that made everyone marvel at their pluck, and came swinging through the main street of the village with a step that seemed as elastic as on the first day of their toilsome tramp. It was now dark, but they spied the general-in-chief watching them with evident pride from the piazza of the hotel as they marched past. Then was witnessed one of the most inspiring scenes of the campaign. Bonfires were lighted on the sides of the streets. The men seized straw and pine knots and improvised torches. Cheers arose from their throats, already hoarse with shouts of victory. Bands played, banners waved, and muskets were swung in the air. A regiment now broke forth with the song of "John Brown's Body," and soon a whole division was shouting the swelling chorus of that popular air, which had risen to the dignity of a national anthem. The night march had become a grand review, with Grant as the reviewing officer. Ord and Gibbon had visited the general at the hotel, and he had spoken with them, as well as with Wright, about sending some communication to Lee that might pave the way to the stopping of further bloodshed. Dr. Smith, formerly of the regular army, a native of Virginia, and a relative of General Ewell, now one of our prisoners, had told General Grant the night before that Ewell had said in conversation that their cause was lost when they crossed the James River, and he considered that it was the duty of the authorities to negotiate for peace then, while they still had a right to claim concessions, adding that now they were not in condition to claim anything. He said that for every man killed after this, somebody would be responsible, and it would be little better than murder. He could not tell what General Lee would do, but he hoped that he would at once surrender his army. This statement, together with the news that had been received from Sheridan, saying that he had heard that General Lee's trains of provisions, which had come by rail, were at Appomattox, and that he expected to capture them before Lee could reach them, induced the general to write the following communication: Headquarters, Armies of the U.S., 5 p.m., April 7, 1865. General R. E. Lee, commanding C.S.A. The results of the last week must convince you of the hopelessness of further resistance on the part of the Army of Northern Virginia in this struggle. I feel that it is so, and regard it as my duty to shift from myself the responsibility of any further effusions of blood by asking of you the surrender of that portion of the Confederate States Army known as the Army of Northern Virginia. U. S. Grant, Lieutenant General. This he entrusted to General Seth Williams, Adjutant General, with directions to take it to Humphreys front, as his corps was close up to the enemy's rear guard, and see that it reached Lee. Williams's orderly was shot, and he himself came near losing his life in getting this communication through the lines. General Grant decided to remain all night at Farmville and await the reply from Lee, and he was shown to a room in the hotel in which he was told that Lee had slept the night before, although this statement could not be verified. Lee wrote the following reply within an hour after he received General Grant's letter, but it was brought in by a rather circuitous route and did not reach its destination till after midnight. April 7, 1865. General, I have received your note of this date. Though not entertaining the opinion you express of the hopelessness of further resistance on the part of the Army of Northern Virginia, I reciprocate your desire to avoid useless effusion of blood, and therefore, before considering your proposition, ask the terms you will offer on condition of its surrender. R. E. Lee, General. Lieutenant General U. S. Grant, Commanding Armies of the U.S. The next morning, before leaving Farmville, the following reply was given to General Seth Williams, who again went to Humphreys front to have it transmitted to Lee. April 8, 1865, General R. E. Lee, commanding C.S.A. Your note of last evening, in reply to mine of the same date, asking the conditions on which I will accept the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia, is just received. In reply would say that, peace being my great desire, there is but one condition I would insist upon, namely that the men and officers surrendered shall be disqualified for taking up arms against the Government of the United States until properly exchanged. I will meet you, or will designate officers to meet any officers you may name for the same purpose, at any point agreeable to you, for the purpose of arranging definitely the terms upon which the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia will be received. U. S. Grant, Lieutenant General. The last sentence shows great delicacy of feeling on the part of General Grant, who wished to spare General Lee the mortification of personally conducting the surrender. The consideration displayed has a parallel in the terms accorded by Washington to Cornwallis at Yorktown. Cornwallis took advantage of the privilege and sent O'Hara to represent him, but Lee rose superior to the British general, and in a manly way came and conducted the surrender in person. There turned up at this time a rather hungry-looking gentleman in gray, wearing the uniform of a colonel, who proclaimed himself the proprietor of the hotel. He gave us to understand that his regiment had crumbled to pieces, that he was about the only portion of it that had succeeded in holding together, and he thought he might as well stop off at home and look after his property. It is safe to say that his hotel had never before had so many guests in it, nor at such reduced rates. His story was significant as indicating the disintegrating process which was going on in the ranks of the enemy. General Grant had been marching most of the way with the columns which were pushing along south of Lee's line of retreat, but expecting that a reply to his last letter would soon be received, and wanting to keep within easy communication with Lee, he decided to march that day with the portion of the Army of the Potomac that was pressing Lee's rear guard. After issuing some further instructions to Ord and Sheridan, he started from Farmville, crossed to the north side of the Appomattox, conferred in person with Meade, and rode with his columns. Encouraging reports came in all day, and that night headquarters were established at Curdsville in a large white farmhouse a few hundred yards from Meade's camp. The general and several of the staff had cut loose from the headquarters trains the night he started to meet Sheridan at Jetersville, and had neither baggage nor camp equipage. The general did not even have his sword with him. This was the most advanced effort yet made in moving in light marching order, and we billeted ourselves at night in farmhouses, or bivouacked on porches, and picked up meals at any camp that seemed to have something to spare in the way of rations. That night we sampled the fare of Meade's hospitable mess, and once more lay down with full stomachs. General Grant had been suffering all the afternoon from a severe headache, the result of fatigue, anxiety, scant fare, and loss of sleep, and by night he grew much worse. He was induced to bathe his feet in hot water and mustard, and apply mustard plasters to his wrists and the back of his neck, but these remedies afforded little relief. The dwelling we occupied was a double house. The general threw himself upon a sofa in the sitting-room on the left side of the hall, while the staff officers bunked on the floor of the room opposite, to catch what sleep they could. About midnight we were aroused by Colonel Charles A. Whittier of Humphreys's staff, who brought the expected letter from Lee. Rawlins took it, and stepped across the hall to the door of General Grant's room. He hesitated to knock, not wishing to awake the commander if he were asleep, and opened the door softly and listened a moment to ascertain whether he could judge by any sound how the chief was resting. Soon the general's voice was heard saying, "Come in. I am awake. I am suffering too much to get any sleep." I had in the meantime brought a lighted candle, and now stepped into the room with it. The general, who had taken off only his coat and boots, sat up on the sofa and read the communication. The letter was as follows: April 8, 1865. General, I received at a late hour your note of today. In mine of yesterday I did not intend to propose the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia, but to ask the terms of your proposition. To be frank, I do not think the emergency has arisen to call for the surrender of this army. But as the restoration of peace should be the sole object of all, I desired to know whether your proposals would lead to that end. I cannot therefore meet you with a view to surrender the Army of Northern Virginia, but as far as your proposal may affect the Confederate States forces under my command, and tend to the restoration of peace, I shall be pleased to meet you at 10 a.m. tomorrow on the old stage road to Richmond, between the picket lines of the two armies. R. E. Lee, General. To Lieutenant General U. S. Grant. The general shook his head, expressive of his disappointment, and remarked, "It looks as if Lee still means to fight. I will reply in the morning," and after making a few more comments, lay down again upon the sofa. Rawlins and I expressed the hope that the general might still be able to get some sleep, and then retired from the room. About 4 o'clock in the morning of April 9, I rose and crossed the hall to ascertain how the general was feeling. I found his room empty, and upon going out of the front door, saw him pacing up and down in the yard, holding both hands to his head. Upon inquiring how he felt, he replied that he had had very little sleep, and was still suffering the most excruciating pain. I said, "Well, there is one consolation in all this, General. I never knew you to be ill that you did not receive some good news before the day passed. I have become a little superstitious regarding these coincidences, and I should not be surprised if some good fortune were to overtake you before night." He smiled and replied, "The best thing that could happen to me today would be to get rid of the pain I am suffering." We were soon joined by some others of the staff, and the general was induced to walk over to Meade's headquarters with us and get some coffee, in the hope that it would do him good. He seemed to feel a little better then, and after writing the following letter to Lee and dispatching it, he prepared to move forward. April 9, 1865. General: Your note of yesterday is received. As I have no authority to treat on the subject of peace, the meeting proposed for 10 a.m. today could lead to no good. I will state, however, General, that I am equally anxious for peace with yourself, and the whole North entertains the same feeling. The terms upon which peace can be had are well understood. By the South laying down their arms, they will hasten that most desirable event, save thousands of human lives, and hundreds of millions of property not yet destroyed. Sincerely hoping that all our difficulties may be settled without the loss of another life, I subscribe myself, and etc., U. S. Grant, Lieutenant General. To General R. E. Lee. General Grant kept steadily in mind the fact that he was simply a soldier, and could deal only with hostile armies. He could not negotiate a treaty of peace without transcending his authority. CHAPTER XXX.